Thank you, guys. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for the presentation of the Spring 2018 Fiscal Monitor. My name is Viktor Krzyżanowski and I'm with the IMF's Communications Department. Let me present the speakers to you. Vitor Gaspar is the Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. Kati Patillo is Assistant Director, and Abdel Senhaji is the Deputy Director at the IMF's Fiscal Department. You have seen the Fiscal Monitor, which has now been released to you. There is also a blog authored by Vitor, which is available to you as well. The way we will do it today is usual. We will first ask Vitor to say a few words about the main findings of the Fiscal Monitor, and then we will be open to your questions, both in the room, and we appreciate that you're joining us this morning, and also online on imf.org. Vitor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for your interest in our work on fiscal policy in the world. As you learn from the World Economic Outlook, global growth is strong and broad-based. The economic upswing should be used to accumulate fiscal buffers for difficult times that will eventually come. Countries are advised to avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policies that exacerbate economic fluctuations and ratchet up public debt. Financial stability and financial risks are, as you have listened to, the focus of the global financial stability report. Countries will be better placed to tackle looming risks if they build strong public finances in good times. At $164 trillion, or almost 225% of GDP, global debt hit a new record high in 2016. Most of this debt is in advanced economies. Nevertheless, in the last 10 years, emerging market economies have been responsible for most of the increase. China alone has contributed 43% to the increase since 2007. In contrast, the contribution from low-income developing countries is barely visible on the slide. Public debt is currently at historic highs in advanced and emerging market economies. Average debt to GDP ratios at more than 105% of GDP in advanced economies are at levels not seen since World War II. In emerging market economies, debt at almost 50% of GDP on average is at levels that in the past have been associated with fiscal crisis. In contrast, for low-income developing countries, average debt to GDP ratios at 44% of GDP are well below historical peaks. But it is important to recall that these peaks involve debt levels that countries were unable to service and were eventually tackled through debt relief initiatives by the international community. Since the completion of the HIPC MDRI initiatives, debt levels have been picking up on average. The increase has been about 13% of GDP in the last 5 years. Our debt sustainability analysis indicate that 40% of low-income countries are currently at high risk of or already in debt distress. This ratio doubled in 5 years. Furthermore, debt service has also been rising rapidly, particularly in countries with high inflation rates. The interest burden has also doubled in the past 10 years to 20% of taxes. The escalating cost reflects in part the increasing reliance on market instruments. Almost half is now non-concessional debt, up from a quarter in 2007. It is imperative that low-income developing countries strengthen their tax capacity. This will allow them to meet their debt service obligations. It will also allow them to finance spending priorities such as health, education, and public infrastructure to attain the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Overall, our forecasts do indicate that public debt to GDP ratios will come down over the next 5 years in about 2/3 of countries. But that is conditional on countries delivering on their fiscal plans. There is no room for complacency. For the period 2018 to 2023, debt ratios will be declining in 3/5 of low-income developing countries and in about 2/3 of emerging market economies. As for advanced economies, debt ratios will be declining in almost all countries. But one country stands out as an exception. In the United States, the revised tax code and the 2-year budget agreement provide additional fiscal stimulus to the economy. These measures will give rise to overall deficits above $1 trillion over the next 3 years, and that corresponds to more than 5% of US GDP. That is projected to increase from 108% in 2017 to 117% of GDP in 2023. If tax cuts with sunset provisions are now not allowed to lapse, public debt would climb even higher. And now you will allow me to conclude repeating what I said right at the beginning. In the Fiscal Monitor, we urge policymakers to avoid pro-cyclical policy actions that provide unnecessary stimulus when economic activity is already pacing up. Instead, most countries should deliver on their fiscal plans and put deficits and debt firmly on a downward path. As I said, there is no room for complacency. No one can predict with precision the ebb and flow of a country's economies. However, experience shows that successful governments are those that prepare ahead for storms looming on the horizon. And now, I thank you for your attention, and my colleagues and myself are eager to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Vitor. I will start to my right, and then we'll move to you guys. Andrew Maeda, Bloomberg.
Hi, Andrew Maeda with Bloomberg News. Your report reminds me of Reinhardt and Rogoff's book on financial crises, which was required reading after the financial crisis. And it points out the link between run-ups in debt, in particular sovereign debt, and financial crises. So, I mean, 164 trillion is a very big number. Why should people think it's going to be any different this time?
So thank you for reminding us of the title of the best-selling book by Reinhardt and Rogoff. This time is different. Indeed, we emphasize in the Fiscal Monitor, our emphasis is on debt. We have put out an update of the data that we released first in the fall of 2016. And now we are in position to show that global debt is at a new record high. That is something that I very much emphasized in the opening statement, and I think it's a very important finding from the Fiscal Monitor. very high levels of debt, in particular if together with rapidly increasing debt, have been shown to be risks to financial stability and risks to broad economic activity. That is one of the reasons why we emphasize that now, in these good times, in this cyclical upswing, it is timely for countries to rebuild fiscal buffers, to build solid foundations of public finance so that they are prepared for harder times that eventually will come. That is the central message of the fiscal monitor, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to emphasize it.
Thank you very much. Chris, please.
Chris Giles, Financial Times. The US administration rejects your analysis of its fiscal outlook and suggests that its tax cuts will so galvanize the US economy that they'll pay for themselves. What's your message, and why are you right and they're wrong?
Thank you.
So our message on the US is predicated on the various scenarios that we include in the fiscal monitor. We regard the tax reform in the US as a complex policy reform that should be looked at in various perspectives. The impact on the business cycle in the United States, tax policy as structural reform, and implications for spillovers. And we use different analytical instruments to look at these various aspects. And so the message is necessary, subtle, and multifaceted. The point that I emphasize as the primary message of this fiscal monitor is that countries should use the business cycle upswing to conduct counter-cyclical policies and build fiscal buffers. In the case of the United States is in a strong business cycle position. The recovery started in the United States a long time ago. The chief economist emphasized yesterday that levels of unemployment are low in the United States, and in our forecast they are deemed to go even lower. So in that context, we would not recommend a easing of fiscal policy. And in our baseline, we do have quite substantial deficits in the US, and we have an accumulation of public debt. In making this forecast, we are actually in line with US organizations like the Congress Budget Office. And the point that I want also to stress is that in line with the recommendations that we have been making to the US in the context of Article 4, we do recommend that the US adopts a medium-term framework which will not only help in the points that we have been discussing, but also help the US tackle long-term challenges associated with the demographic change and population aging, as they are reflected in future pension liabilities and the dynamics of health spending.
Thank you very much. Onyinye?
Okay, Onyinye Nwachukwu from Nigeria Business Day newspaper. Okay, what concerns are there, if any, around excessive bond issuance? We have seen elevated levels in recent times. Do you think there's any concerns, around that? And then government authorities, our government authorities, Nigerian government authorities are balancing debt structure in favor of external borrowing. They say this should be cheaper than domestic borrowing. Do you think this is a better option? Or what else do you think, we could handle this?
Thank you very much, Onyinye. Kati, would you start with the last question? It's okay.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you. So the first point to make on borrowing in Africa and Nigeria in particular is that I think we can all agree for sub-Saharan African countries that sustained development and increasing per capita income growth, which is built on macro stability, is the main priority. And the fund has been working with African countries then to help build tax capacity so that countries can sustain levels of public debt, and also then so that they can mobilize spending for health, education, infrastructure. And so the composition of borrowing in countries is changing, as you mentioned, and those rising public debt levels and the change in composition is creating some vulnerabilities and risks. Borrowing by countries can create benefits if it's used for productive investment, and the returns are captured. However, evidence suggests that's not the case in some countries. So rising debt then that creates these vulnerabilities. There can be interest rate risk, market risk, and large interest burdens then that can squeeze out then spending on other priorities. So with high debt, then countries need to deliver on their fiscal plans for adjustment and use borrowed funds for high return investment. The choice between external debt and domestic debt, as you say, reflects then the levels and the costs. But the main point is that then countries need to use all borrowed funds for high return investment and to deliver on their fiscal plans and to build tax capacity.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Let's do the following. Let's do Portugal, Greece, and then Brazil.
Hi, I'm Mario Batista from the Portuguese news agency. You delivered the projections for the deficit in Portugal, which are more negative than the projections by the Portuguese government. Could you clarify the difference between one and the other? Thank you.
Thank you. Abdel.
Yes. First, I think it's important to mention that the economic outlook for Portugal has improved significantly since last year. I think growth has picked up quite a bit in line with the upswing in Europe. Inflation is moving toward target. And I think consolidation is progressing relatively well. Of course, I think, as Victor said, there is no room for complacency in all countries, and particularly in Portugal, where the debt ratio still remains very high at 126% of GDP. It's still the third highest in Europe. And therefore, sustained progress in terms of fiscal consolidation and also structural reform that would put firmly the debt ratio on a downward path is important. Now, regarding the specific question that you mentioned, I think the numbers that were publicized recently came after our forecast in the World Economic Outlook. And therefore, as you know, we revise this forecast on a regular basis, and we will do so in the context of the upcoming Article 4 mission, which is planned for late May.
Thank you very much, Abdel. Let's go to Greece. In the second row, sorry. Len.
Thank you. This is Lena Argyri with Greek TV. Can you please walk us through your decision to revise upwards the primary surplus numbers for Greece? I mean, what led you there, and what has changed the last 6 months? Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me be very brief and refer you to the briefing by the European Department on Friday. But I want to repeat a couple of things. Number one, the recent trends in the Greek economy have been favorable. The situation and prospects have improved in Greece. The position of the IMF concerning policies in Greece going forward has not changed, as emphasized yesterday by the chief economist. We insist in the necessary balance between policy in Greece and debt relief, and a combination of fiscal adjustment, structural reforms, and debt relief are fundamental, in our view, to put Greece on a sustainable growth path.
Thank you very much, Vitor. Let's go to Brazil.
Good morning, Ricardo Leopoldo, Agência. How are you doing, sir? In Fiscal Monitor, the projections show that Brazil is going to postpone a little the primary surplus. Instead to be 2021, it's going to be 2022 with 0.1% of GDP. On the other hand, IMF says in the report that Brazil is supposed to take advantage of the momentum of the economy this time to speed up the fiscal adjustments. And the question is this: if you could elaborate a little bit, and if in your projections, IMF consider some social security reform happening next year or in a couple of years or not?
Thank you.
So Brazil is a very good example because, as you've learned by now, our main emphasis is on debt, private and public debt. And in the case of Brazil, what we do see is that going forward, the public debt to GDP ratio under the policy assumptions in the World Economic Outlook and the Fiscal Monitor will be pacing up. By the end of the forecast horizon, which is 2023, the debt to GDP ratio in Brazil would stand at about 96% of GDP, and that level is very high in the context of emerging market economies. It will be a very high debt level. Moreover, if you look at changes in the debt to GDP ratio around the world and in emerging market economies, you see again that Brazil stands out. The increase that is forecast for the public debt to GDP ratio in Brazil is substantially more pronounced than the increase in U.S. public debt to GDP ratio that I emphasized a moment ago. So this is, in a sense, to emphasize that the issue of tackling public debt in Brazil, adopting a medium-term plan to bring it down and to bring it under control is crucial. Our understanding is that the undercurrent plans, the government of Brazil is of the view that public debt to GDP would be stabilizing in 2024, which is 1 year after our forecasting horizon. Our recommendation would be to try to tackle the issue of public debt accumulation in Brazil earlier on and try to bring forward the adjustment. Now, the timing of this policy actions are, of course, predicated on the political evolution in Brazil that, of course, you know much better than I do.
Thank you very much, Vitor. Let me quickly turn to our colleagues online. We have a question from El Economista in Spain, and then we go to China and India. El Economista in Spain is asking what kind of measures does the government need to take to achieve its deficit reduction goal of 0.5% of GDP by 2020. Is it too ambitious, Vitor?
No, we don't think that the goal of the government is too ambitious. We would support adjustment. We do support adjustment in Spain. Spain is a part of a group of economies in Europe that we would characterize as high debt. And in those, we do recommend not only that these countries avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policies, but also that they continue to adjust in order to control and bring down high debt levels, which we have emphasized are a source of vulnerability to these economies. We insist that this should be done in a growth-friendly way. But apart from that, the exact combination of policies which better serves these goals is something that the country authorities are responsible for.
Thank you very much, Vitor. We're looking forward to other questions on IMF.org. I'm with you guys now, so show me your hands. Who wants to ask the question? That I have an orientation. Very good. The colleague from China and then the colleague from India, please. Second row first.
Victor, Chinese government has lowered, Wang Guan with China Central Television, has lowered its deficit target from 3% to 2.6% of GDP, along with other measures. Do you think China has a good policy mix to ring in its debt challenge? Thanks.
Thank you.
So if we look at China, as you probably got from the press conference on the Global Financial Stability Report, the main concern has to do with the level and pace of accumulation of overall debt, private and public. Okay? So the control over the debt level, and in particular the rhythm of debt accumulation, is a major challenge for the Chinese economy. In terms of public finances, the official numbers for the debt and deficit are modest. The issue is that China does carry out quite a substantial share of its public expenditures at subnational levels. Specifically, the proportion is 85% of GDP, and in the context of the 2014 budget law, there was an assumption of debt associated with the financial vehicles that are linked to local governments in a substantial amount that exceeded 20% of GDP. That means that in the Fiscal Monitor and the World Economic Outlook, we monitor a set of aggregates that go beyond the official definition of debt. And if you focus on that, you do see that there is a projected accumulation of debt which is sizable in the period 2018 to 2023. Again, to put it in perspective, I just commented on the debt accumulation in Brazil. The increase in debt in China, according to this concept, would be faster and more important in terms of percentage points of GDP than the increase in Brazil. The level of the debt ratio would be substantially lower. So there are two challenges that China has to tackle. One, how can the government, in terms of its decisions on public finance, best support the overall rebalancing of the Chinese economy, including the slowdown in the increase in the level of debt? So that's the first challenge. Second, as recognized by the State Council in 2016, there is an issue of vertical imbalance in the public finances in China, and in order for China to be able to organize itself efficiently in the provision of public services and ensure fiscal discipline at all levels of government, it is necessary to rethink the sources of revenues for subnational governments. That reform process, as you know better than me, is ongoing, and it's an issue which is recognized and is being tackled by the Chinese authorities.
Thank you, Vitor. Lalit, good morning.
Good morning. This is Lalit Jha from PTI Press Trust of India. Where is India placed in your debt to GDP ratio? Is it an issue of concern for the IMF? And do you think Indian government is taking enough steps to address that? And secondly, on the China's BRI initiative, how is it adding to the debt to GDP ratio and your concerns to the developed third world countries?
Thank you, Peter.
So I will answer the BRI question, and Abdel, you will answer the India question. On the Belt and Road Initiative, we have a very ambitious initiative that promises to increase public investment in an ample set of countries. Increasing public investment, if it is productive, is very important in many countries. So that's something that deserves to be supported. But you're absolutely right in asking about levels of debt. Public investment contributes to fiscal sustainability in case the investment is efficient and effective, in case the investment is productive. And in order to have that, it's very important that in many countries to upgrade their public investment management systems. And the IMF has been engaging over the years in capacity development in many countries, precisely to contribute to have the right conditions in place. Moreover, when it comes to debt, it's extremely important that the debt commitments be transparent and transparently assumed so that they can be appropriately reflected in the medium and long-term programming of public finances. I could go more detailed, but I don't think that I should do it here and now. Abdel?
So for India, the outlook, both short and medium term, remains quite favorable. Growth has picked up to about 7.5% in 2017, is planned actually or projected to pick up in 2018. And over the medium term, it is projected actually to reach above 8%, one of the highest growth rates in the world. Of course, debt remains relatively high. You're right, at 70% of GDP in 2017. But the authorities are well aware of the problem. And of course, they are, after pausing in terms of their fiscal consolidation plan in 2017, fiscal year 2017-18, they are planning to continue with the consolidation plan in the current fiscal year and over the medium term. They are in fact targeting a federal deficit of 3% over the medium term, and they are targeting also a debt ratio of 40% over the medium term at the federal level, which correspond to about 60% at the general government level. And we believe that those targets are appropriate. I think you're right. The debt level is relatively high, but the authorities are planning to bring it down over the medium term with the right policies.
Thank you very much, Abdel. Gentleman in the first row, and then we move to Ukraine.
Thank you. My name is Simon Ateba from Today News Africa. Could you please talk more about Africa and give us some specifics about the debt and the challenges and what the African continent has to do? And finally, last year you made similar forecasts and projections. Do you have the feeling that African leaders listen to you? Are they implementing all these forecasts or recommendations that you make here at the IMF? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Kati?
Thank you. So for Africa as a whole, then, in terms of the fiscal policy priorities, I'll mention three. First, prudent fiscal policy is needed in most countries to rein in the buildup in public debt. And when you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, there is a lot of variety. There are many countries. Africa is not a bloc. And it's important in particular to look at the different experiences and policy priorities for oil exporting countries and other commodity exporting countries, and then also for the non-commodity exporting countries. And so in terms of this first priority for oil exporters in particular, there's a need to adjust their fiscal positions, taking advantage of the uptick in commodity prices. And a high priority is building up the capacity for more non-oil revenues, as well as enhancing the efficiency of public spending. So that's oil. For non-commodity exporters, then some of them have accumulated high levels of debt associated with public investment, and so they will need then to make spending more efficient, and in some cases where there has been large public investment, it might be time for the governments to hand over the reins of investment then to the private sector. So that's the first point. The second point is that overall for Sub-Saharan Africa, domestic revenue mobilization is really one of the most pressing challenges. Countries have very low, relatively low levels of tax to GDP, but there is great potential then over the next several years. Countries could mobilize on average 3 to 5% of GDP in additional tax revenues by strengthening VAT systems, reducing exemptions, and expanding income tax coverage, and harnessing new technologies, which is the subject of our Fiscal Monitor chapter on digitalization. So that's a second priority. And of course, then fiscal adjustment should strike the appropriate balance then between debt sustainability and addressing important development needs. So the revenue mobilization that I talked about then can give countries the ability to spend on pressing development needs, human capital, physical capital, and protect social spending even during fiscal consolidation.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We'll go to Maria in the second row, and then I'll ask Larry to conclude. Which was apologies. Maria, could you be so kind and take the mic? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I asked you if you made a similar projection last year. Do you have the feeling that African leaders implement your recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, yeah. So the emphasis that we put is that exactly as you say, countries are very much planning then strong policies, fiscal consolidation, recognizing that the time is now. The key is implementation, delivering on those plans. And we work then very closely with countries, both countries that are involved in IMF-supported programs and other countries through our policy advice and technical assistance to help them then with the push for implementing their plans.
Thank you, Kathy. Victor.
Allow me one example. I was myself recently in Cote d'Ivoire, and in Cote d'Ivoire we organized a hackathon, which is a session that brings together people who deal with public policy, people who are representing civil society, corporations, people who are IT experts. And in the specific case of the Cote d'Ivoire hackathon, we were trying to challenge this crowd to solve long-standing problems in tax administration. And this was a very creative process that took about 2 days. And at the end of 2 days, we had 10 competing ideas, 10 competing projects. We, together with the responsibles from the tax administration, from the Ministry of Budget, picked up the three winning proposals, and those are now being worked on to be implemented in Cote d'Ivoire. So I don't think that your question allows, as Kathy was emphasizing, a blanket type of answer. It is about bilateral engagement with countries, and often, as it was the case for the Cote d'Ivoire hackathon, it is a very rewarding and useful experience for, I believe, the authorities of the country and for us as well.
Thank you very much, Peter. Maria?
Maria Tsaturan, Ukrainian news agency RBC Ukraine. Some emerging and especially low-income countries increase public debt trying to move out financial crisis circumstances. For example, Ukraine attracts external borrowing trying to maintain national currency rate, central bank reserves, infrastructure reforms. Could you concretize which fiscal buffers or fiscal stimulus could be implemented for the countries that have same situation as our country, as my country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should we ask Abdel to first comment on Ukraine?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think Ukraine made remarkable progress in the first years of the program with the fund. Particularly in 2014 and 15, there was significant progress that was made. Unfortunately, in subsequent years, progress has been slow to come, and the fund is trying to engage with the authorities on the issue of continuing with the program and its objectives. I think in terms of priorities, obviously one of the main priorities to continue with the reform of the price mechanism for gas pricing. As you know, there was a formula, an automatic formula for the evolution of prices, and we would like the authorities to go back to that formula. We would like them also to tackle the problem of corruption and governance, which is quite important. And we would like them also, of course, to continue with the consolidation program that they have agreed open at the beginning of the program. I think this would certainly put the program again on track, and we hope that the discussion going forward will reach an agreement very soon.
Thank you very much, Abdel. Larry, please give us the honor, and let's conclude.
Thank you very much, Victor. Larry Elliott of The Guardian. 40% of low-income countries are in debt distress or will soon be in debt distress. A lot of them are borrowed from the capital markets, and global interest rates are going up. How close are we to a new developing country debt crisis?
Thank you.
Do you want to address that, Kevin?
Okay. Yeah. So specifically for Sub-Saharan Africa, debt vulnerabilities have risen in some countries in the region, and 6 low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa are in debt distress. And the causes are country-specific, but most of the countries are in fragile situations, or they're facing adjustment then to the price of their major export commodity. Our projections show that if countries fully implement their planned fiscal consolidation plans, debt levels will stabilize and remain sustainable. There's variation, so the projections show 2/3 of countries then in the medium term debt would be going down, so that means another third not. So these average public debt levels are projected to stabilize, but the forecasts are predicated then on strong fiscal adjustment and or an acceleration in growth. So as Vitor said at the beginning, there's no room for complacency. Also in the case of sub-Saharan Africa and low-income countries more generally, they have to deliver on their planned adjustment, and to do this in the most growth-friendly way, countries have to strengthen their tax capacity. So those are the priorities for addressing the debt.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Vitor, why don't you say a few words to conclude, and then we will.
Yes, I would definitely like to conclude. The first thing that I want to say is just to amplify what Cathy has just said. When we insist that low-income countries should be improving, increasing their tax revenue mobilization, we see that as an instrument for sustainable development. In that context, higher tax capacity will also help sustain debt service, but that is not an end in itself. The end in itself is sustainable development, which is served by state capacity and the ability to spend on priority areas that Cathy has already emphasized: health, education, public infrastructure, and much else. I will just beg your indulgence for 30 seconds more, just to insist that our main topic in this fiscal monitor was debt, very high debt levels, public and private, in the context of a very favorable upswing. In the context of good times, governments are well advised to build fiscal buffers so that they're ready to tackle challenges that will inevitably come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vitor. Thank you very much for joining us this morning here in the room and online. This is, of course, just the beginning of the spring meetings. We will have the press conference of Managing Director tomorrow, and then all the regional press conference, so please stay with us. For any follow-up questions, Cathy and Abdel are staying in the room. Cathy, happy to answer any questions on Africa, and Abdel, all the questions he can answer. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys, for presenting it, and see you next time.